The room didn't feel competitive. That was the mistake. Jimmy Page stood near the amplifier, casual in posture, confident in a way that didn't need to announce itself. He had just finished playing, clean, controlled, precise. Every note landed exactly where it was meant to. The kind of playing that earned nods instead of applause. People looked impressed. Someone even smiled and said, "That was tight." Jimmy heard it. He accepted it. He was used to that reaction. Across the room, Jimi Hendrix hadn't moved. He was leaning slightly against the wall, guitar hanging loose at his side, eyes lowered, not in disinterest, but in quiet attention. He hadn't touched a string yet. He hadn't warmed up. He hadn't asked what key they were in. That mattered. Jimmy glanced over briefly, then looked away. Not dismissive. Certain. In rooms like this, certainty carried weight. Jimmy Page had earned his reputation carefully. Session work, discipline, structure. He believed music revealed itself through control, through knowing where you were going before you got there. And just now, he believed he had gone there cleanly. Someone finally turned to Jimmy. "You want to take a pass?" It wasn't a challenge. It was an afterthought. Jimmy nodded once and stepped forward. Still no rush. He didn't adjust the amp right away. Didn't test the sound. Didn't ask for volume. He just lifted the guitar slightly, as if checking its weight rather than its tuning. Jimmy watched from the corner of his eye. This was the part he understood well, the moment after a strong performance, when the next person had to respond. Usually they try to match it. Sometimes they overplayed. Sometimes they retreated. Either way, the hierarchy revealed itself quickly. Jimmy rested his fingers on the strings and waited. The silence stretched longer than expected. Not awkward. Intentional. Someone shifted their footing. Another cleared their throat. Jimmy felt the room lean forward slightly, as if anticipating something dramatic. Jimmy still didn't play. Then, without warning, he struck a single note. Just one. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even clean. But it wasn't accidental either. The note bent slightly as it faded, not upward or downward in any predictable way, but sideways. Unsettling, unresolved. Jimmy frowned, almost imperceptibly. That wasn't technique. That was a question. Jimmy let the note die completely before adding anything else. When he finally did, it wasn't a riff. It wasn't a melody. It was space. Short phrases appeared and disappeared, each one incomplete on purpose. Jimmy wasn't building towards something. He was circling it. Jimmy felt a shift, not in volume, not in speed, but in orientation. The room was no longer listening to the music. It was waiting with it. That unsettled him. Jimmy prided himself on anticipation, on understanding where music wanted to go before it arrived. But this wasn't heading anywhere obvious. There was no structure to grab onto. Jimmy finally introduced rhythm, but only enough to suggest it. A pulse that hinted at time without committing to it. Jimmy realized something then. This wasn't a response. It was a refusal to compete. Jimmy wasn't answering what had just been played. He was changing the terms of the exchange. The room went quieter, not because people were impressed, but because they were recalibrating. The kind of silence that follows when a familiar framework stops working. Jimmy crossed his arms slowly. He didn't feel threatened, but he didn't feel certain anymore either. Jimmy's playing grew slightly denser, but never crowded. Notes overlapped briefly, then stepped aside for each other. There was tension, but no urgency. Control, without containment. Jimmy listened carefully, searching for something to measure. A mistake. A pattern. A moment where the illusion would slip. It didn't. What unsettled him most was how little Jimmy seemed to care whether it landed. He wasn't watching faces. He wasn't gauging reactions. He wasn't proving anything. He was listening to the guitar, to the room, to the silence between sounds. Jimmy felt a subtle heat rise behind his eyes. Not anger. Something closer to recognition. This wasn't about who played better. This was about who decided what better meant. Jimmy ended the phrase the same way he began it, with a single note. Then he stopped. No flourish. No final chord. Just silence. The room didn't react immediately. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if everyone was waiting for permission to break the spell. Jimi was the first to breathe out. He nodded once, slowly. Not in defeat, in recalculation, because something had shifted, and he could feel it. He had played to demonstrate mastery. Jimi had played to expose the space around it. And suddenly, mastery felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Jimi looked at Jimi now, really looked at him. Not as a competitor, not even as a peer, but as someone standing slightly outside the system Jimi trusted. That was dangerous, because systems only work as long as everyone agrees to stay inside them. And Jimi Hendrix clearly did not. The room began to murmur softly. Someone laughed nervously. Another picked up a drink that had been forgotten. Jimi remained still. He wasn't embarrassed, but he wasn't unchanged either, because in that moment, he realized something uncomfortable. He had played perfectly, and it hadn't mattered. Not because it wasn't good, but because Jimi hadn't played the same game. And when the rules change mid-room, certainty is the first thing to disappear. Jimmy Page hadn't lost, but for the first time that night, he wasn't sure he had won. And Jimi Hendrix hadn't said a word. No one spoke right away. That silence wasn't awkward, it was diagnostic. The kind of pause where people search for a familiar reaction and realize none of them fit. Jimmy Page stayed where he was, arms still crossed, eyes fixed on the floor just in front of Jimmy's boots. He wasn't replaying the notes. He was replaying the absence of them. Jimmy didn't move. He didn't look up. He didn't wait for approval. He simply stood there, guitar resting against him like it had already said everything it needed to say. Someone finally broke the quiet. That was different. Jimmy didn't respond. He was used to hearing adjectives after he played. Tight, clean, perfect. This one hadn't earned an adjective yet. Jimmy glanced around the room, not to collect reactions, but as if checking whether the space itself had settled. Only then did he shift his weight and gently unplug the cable from the amp. That small, practical gesture changed the temperature. It signaled finality. Jimmy uncrossed his arms. You weren't following the changes, he said calmly. Not accusing. Observational. Jimmy looked at him for the first time. His expression was neutral. Open. I heard them, he said. I just didn't chase them. Jimmy nodded slowly. You ignored the structure. Jimmy considered that. I'll listen for it first. That answer landed heavier than Jimmy expected. Most players defended themselves with theory, with intention, with explanation. Jimmy offered none of that. Just a distinction. Listening versus chasing. Jimmy leaned back against the amp, eyes narrowing slightly, not in hostility, but in focus. So what were you playing toward? Jimmy smiled faintly. I wasn't. The room shifted again. That wasn't a philosophical dodge. It was a practical one. It meant Jimmy hadn't been building tension to release it. He had been letting tension exist. Jimmy felt a subtle resistance rise in him. Not anger. Friction. The kind that comes when something challenges the logic you rely on. But you ended it, Jimmy said. That means you knew where it was going. Jimmy shook his head. I knew when it was done. That distinction unsettled Jimmy more than the playing itself. Knowing where something is going implies control. Knowing when it's done implies awareness. They weren't the same thing. Jimmy looked around the room now, noticing faces he hadn't before. Some looked confused, others thoughtful, a few quietly energized. None of them looked bored. That bothered him, because boredom was usually the signal that something hadn't landed. This had landed, just not in a way he could measure. Play again, Jimmy said suddenly. The room froze slightly. Jimmy didn't react right away. He tilted his head, listening, not to Jimmy, but to the room itself. Then he reached down and plugged the cable back in. No adjustments, no tuning. He began differently this time. There was rhythm now, but not the kind Jimmy had laid down earlier. It wasn't counted. It breathed, expanded and contracted subtly, like it was responding to pressure rather than time. Jimmy listened intently, tracking it, trying to map it. Every time he thought he had it, Jimmy shifted just enough to slip past the expectation without breaking it. That was the trick. The structure was there, but it refused to be pinned down. Jimi felt something unfamiliar surface. Not intimidation. Respect. Not for technique, but for choice. Jimi was choosing when not to resolve, when to withhold, when to leave the question open. Most musicians filled space to prove capability. Jimi was emptying it to test attention. When he stopped again, the silence felt different than before. Less shocked, more alert. Jimi realized he hadn't thought about his own playing for several minutes. He had been listening. That alone told him something had shifted. He stepped forward slightly. You don't play like you're trying to win. Jimi shrugged. I don't hear music as something you win. Jimi smiled despite himself. Then what is it? Jimi looked down at the guitar, then back up. Something you enter. That answer stayed in the room long after the sound had gone. Jimi nodded once. Not because he agreed completely, but because something inside him had moved, and it wasn't moving back. For the first time that night, Jimmy Page wasn't thinking about what he would play next. He was thinking about how he listened, and that realization didn't feel temporary. It felt permanent. The room never fully returned to its previous shape. People stayed longer than they needed to. Conversations drifted instead of concluding. No one felt in a hurry to name what had happened, and that reluctance said more than enthusiasm ever could. Jimmy Page leaned against the wall now, arms at his sides. His posture had changed, less closed, less declarative. He wasn't trying to assert space anymore. He was sharing it. Jimi Hendrix sat on the edge of a chair, guitar resting quietly across his lap. He wasn't playing. He wasn't preparing to play. He was listening to the room exhale. Someone asked a technical question eventually. It felt safer than speaking directly about what had just unfolded. How do you keep it from falling apart? A bassist asked, gesturing vaguely, as if pointing to something invisible. Jimmy considered the question carefully. You don't, he said. You let it show you where it's weak. The bassist frowned, and then Jimmy smiled faintly. Then it teaches you where to stand. Jimmy watched this exchange closely. That wasn't how he had been taught. Weakness was something you corrected before it could be seen, something you disguised with precision. But what Jimmy was describing wasn't carelessness. It was exposure with intent. Jimmy realized then that what bothered him wasn't that Jimmy had played differently. It was that Jimmy hadn't protected himself from being misunderstood. That required a different kind of confidence. As the room thinned out, only a few people remained. The energy had softened into something more reflective. Less performance, more presence. Jimmy stepped closer to Jimmy and sat across from him. You don't seem interested in control, Jimmy said. Jimmy looked up. I'm interested in responsibility. Jimmy raised an eyebrow. Responsibility to what? To the sound, Jimmy replied. Not the idea of it. That landed quietly. Jimmy looked down at his hands. These were the hands that had built riffs people would study, analyze, deconstruct. He had always trusted them to know what to do. But now he wondered whether he had been asking them the right questions. Doesn't it ever scare you? Jimmy asked, not knowing where it's going. Jimmy shook his head. It scares me when I know. Jimmy laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was true in a way he hadn't admitted before. They sat in silence for a moment. Not an awkward one, a shared one. Then Jimmy spoke again, more quietly. I thought I had it earlier. Jimmy nodded. You did. Jimmy looked at him surprised. Then what changed? Jimmy thought for a moment. You stopped listening to the room. That stung. Not sharply, but deeply. Jimmy exhaled slowly. You think I was playing at people. Jimmy tilted his head. You were showing them something. And you weren't. Jimmy smiled. I was asking them something. That difference settled heavily between them. Jimmy nodded, slowly, thoughtfully. I see. It wasn't surrender. It was adjustment. Later, as the last few people gathered their things, Jimmy picked up his guitar again. Not to perform, but to test something. He played a simple phrase. Unadorned. No flourish. He let it hang. Then he waited. Jimmy listened. Jimmy didn't fill the silence. When he finally played again, it was softer, less certain, but more open. Jimmy nodded. No words were exchanged. It didn't need to be, because something fundamental had shifted, not in the hierarchy of the room, but in its orientation. Jimmy Page hadn't been diminished. He had been redirected. And redirection, he realized, could be more unsettling than defeat, because it implied continuation. The room emptied completely. Only the echo of what hadn't been played lingered. And Jimmy knew, with quiet certainty, that the way he listened would never return to what it had been before. Not because Jimmy had overpowered him, but because Jimmy had made space where none had existed. And once you hear music that way, you can't unhear it. The shift didn't announce itself the next day. It showed up quietly, in rehearsal rooms and sound checks, in moments where Jimmy would normally fill space without thinking. He noticed his hands hesitating, not from doubt, but from listening for something they hadn't needed before. Silence. That absence felt unfamiliar. Jimmy had always treated silence as a boundary, something to cross quickly, decisively. Now it felt like terrain, something you stepped on it carefully. He began pausing between phrases, not dramatically, just long enough to feel the room respond. Sometimes it didn't. That unsettled him more than any mistake ever had. He thought about Jimmy often in those pauses, not about the notes he played, but about the ones he didn't, about how little he seemed to care whether people followed him immediately. That kind of freedom came at a cost. Jimmy wasn't sure he had paid it before. Weeks passed. Shows continued. The audience reacted as they always had. Cheers, recognition, expectation. But Jimmy noticed something new in himself. He wasn't playing for the crowd as much. He was playing through the moment. One night, mid-set, he let a phrase dissolve instead of resolving it. He didn't rush to correct it. He didn't force a climax. The crowd leaned in. That reaction startled him. He realized then that the room didn't need certainty as much as he thought. It needed honesty. Backstage later, someone commented, "That section felt different tonight." Jimmy nodded. It was. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. In quieter moments, Jimmy replayed that original session in his mind. Not with frustration, but with clarity. He saw now that he hadn't been beaten. He had been interrupted. Interrupted in the best possible way. Jimmy hadn't dismantled his skill. He had reframed its purpose. Jimmy began experimenting, not with technique, but with restraint, leaving gaps, allowing tension to exist without immediate payoff. Some nights it worked beautifully. Other nights it didn't. But even the failures felt instructive, because they were honest. He understood now why Jimmy hadn't chased structure. Structure was useful, but it wasn't the point. The point was presence. And presence couldn't be rehearsed. It had to be entered. Jimmy never spoke publicly about that night. There was no story to tell that wouldn't diminish it. Turning it into a narrative would have turned it into something smaller. So he let it remain private. A recalibration rather than a revelation. Sometime later, Jimmy crossed paths again briefly. No instruments. No audience. Just a nod. That was enough. Jimmy returned to his work with something new. Not a technique, not a philosophy, but a permission he hadn't known he needed. Permission to wait. Permission to listen. Permission to let the room lead sometimes. And in that space, something unexpected happened. The music felt larger, not because it was louder, but because it had room to breathe. Nothing about the moment became public record. There were no interviews dissecting it. No quotes passed around as proof. No version of the story that could be simplified into a victory or a loss. That was fitting, because what happened that night wasn't an exchange of skill. It was an exchange of perspective. Jimmy Page continued to be Jimmy Page. His precision didn't vanish. His control didn't weaken. If anything, it sharpened, but it was no longer the center of his playing. Something else had moved into that space. Awareness. He began treating silence not as a pause between ideas, but as part of the idea itself, letting moments stretch just long enough to feel the room answer back. Audiences felt it, even if they couldn't name it. There was a new tension in the air, not the kind built by speed or volume, but by restraint. Jimi never credited Jimi Hendrix for this shift, not because he didn't acknowledge it, but because naming it would have reduced it. Some changes don't ask to be explained. They ask to be carried forward. Jimi, for his part, never followed up. He didn't check in, didn't comment. He didn't need to. His response had already done its work. Years later, someone asked Jimi what made certain musicians unforgettable. He didn't mention talent. He didn't mention discipline. He paused for a long moment before answering. They listened past themselves, he said. That was all. If you're still here listening to this story, understand what actually changed. Jimmy Page didn't lose his place. He expanded it. And Jimi Hendrix didn't change him by overpowering him, embarrassing him, or proving him wrong. He changed him by refusing to compete at all. Sometimes, the most lasting influence doesn't come from being louder, faster, or better. It comes from standing still long enough for someone else to hear what they've been missing. And once that happens, there's no going back. Because silence, when used honestly, has a way of rewriting everything that comes after it.